Serbian diaspora in Canada has always tried to have some medium of information over the decades. Many different political and ideological groups of Serbs tried to have their own bulletins or newspapers to comment on their reality through the prism of their beliefs. Often these newspapers caused more conflict and divisions than they provided information to the wider readership. Here we will explore the beginnings of journalism in Windsor, how it arrived to the city, who was in the sphere of the newspaper reporting and editing, and how this media evolved over the years. As early as 1907, several newspapers were regularly mailed to Serbs in Canada from the United States. Among the most prominent were Narodni glasnik, Radnička straža, and Američki Srbobran. Radnička straža was the socialist newspaper of the Yugoslav Socialist League, originally started by the Yugoslav Political Club of the United States. Aside from the local journalism, there were also newspapers from Yugoslavia coming in regularly and distributed to the population through Serbian bookstores in larger cities, newsagents, mail, etc. Several newspapers and journals have been created and published by Canadian Serbs and by Serbs who participated in other Canadian Yugoslav organizations. These publications were intended for the Serbs in the States as well. The first Serbian newspaper in Canada, Kanadski glasnik, was published in Welland and was followed by Serbian Herald and several others. As well, various publications put out by the church congregations, women, youth, students, and business professional groups play important roles in Serbian communities in Canada. By now, many old documents have been donated to the provincial and federal archives for public use. The Serbian National Shield Society as an organization existed in the States when the World War I started. As the war spread and Serbia was under enormous pressure to survive as a country, Serbs in Canada also decided to found Serbian National Shield Society of Canada in 1916 in Toronto. Very soon, its branches started spreading all over Ontario and even reaching Alberta. To unify all those newly established branches, Serbian National Shield Society organized the first Congress at the Serbian Hall in Welland, Ontario. One of the results of their work that day was the founding of Canadian Herald newspaper that would represent the activities of the Serbian National Shield Society to its members and a wider Serbian population in Canada. With the start of World War II came the need of the Serbian diaspora in Canada to unify once more into one integrated Serbian community. Therefore, the first Serbian Congress was scheduled for December 1942. In Windsor, where 8 branches of the organization were represented, with the goal of uniting them all into a cohesive and a strong organization. To fortify its ranks, Serbian National Shield Society invited all representatives of all Serbian organizations in Canada to attend the meeting at the summer of 1943. The Yugoslav Canadian Society sent out an invitation through the Voice of Canadian Serbs. The meeting was held in Toronto and all 62 representatives attended. The agreement was accomplished that in September of 1943 in Hamilton, there will be an all-Serbian Congress where all societies and all organizations will function under the umbrella of the Serbian National Shield Society to further the Serbian interests. Following goals were agreed upon: informing all Serbs in Canada of the most current events in Yugoslavia and locally via its official newspaper, Voice of Canada, soon after renamed into Voice of Canadian Serbs; suppression of already strong communist propaganda; informing the Canadian public of the devastation that Serbs endured in the occupied Yugoslavia; organizing cultural events which would heighten the spirits of Serbs in Canada; fundraising for the resistance movement of General Mihailovic and his fighters in Yugoslavia; using the press for the benefit of the Serbian National Shield Society. The Serbian National Shield Society energetically assisted in the material and moral fight against Nazism and Fascism during the World War II. Immediately after the ending of World War II, the Serbian National Shield Society worked intensively with the Canadian government to allow Serbian refugees from all over Europe to immigrate to Canada under favorable conditions. Up to 10,000 Serbian refugees entered Canada between 1945 and 1948 as a direct result of the work of the Serbian National Shield Society. The society continued to promote the ideas of unity and tolerance between many fractions of Serbs as well as with other nations of Yugoslavia. For its constructive, positive, national and democratic work, Canadian public awarded the Serbian National Shield Society with many recognitions and awards. One of them came from the Queen Elizabeth II on June 2, 1953, on the day of her coronation, the Order of the Crown. This very prestigious award came on the recommendation of the Canadian government. The society was instrumental in initiating newspapers to represent its goals and activities. From the first days through the Canadian Herald from 1916, through the Voice of Canada, bridging those years between the world wars and the period of inactivity, and finally to the Voice of Canadian Serbs when the Serbian National Shield Society reactivated and actively continued its work in preserving Serbian culture, traditions, and political interests. Voice of Canada was published as a weekly in continuation from 1934 to 1944 under the watchful eye and a sharp pen of its owner and editor Božidar M. Marković. He was also one of the founding members of the Serbian National Shield Society since its first days and was a supporter during the years of inactivity. It could be said with great degree of certainty that his Voice of Canada was an informative medium promoting ideals that the Serbian National Shield Society would applaud. Once the society was reactivated in 1943 with the First Serbian Congress in Hamilton, Voice of Canada was there to cover all these historic events. As the time was passing and the World War II was slowly coming to an end, the Serbian National Shield Society Board of Directors felt that there is greater need to adopt The Voice as its official newspaper. The society provided Mr. Marković with $3,000 to purchase the paper. Voice of Canada changed its name into Voice of Canadian Serbs in 1944, and its current editor, Božidar Marković, decided to stay on for a while until the transition is completed. Mr. Pero Bulad, who was the president of the Shield Society at the time, felt that the Windsor chapter of the Shield Society was strong and capable enough to handle the transition and the transfer of the newspaper from Toronto to Windsor. During the Society Congress in the fall of 1945, the decision was made to transfer the paper to Windsor. The first issue was printed on November 15, 1945. The first editorial of the Voice of Canadian Serbs stated the newspaper's mission and its role within the Serbian community in Canada. The motto of the Voice was "With the people, for the people." The goal of the paper was to preserve the Serbian language, heritage, and traditions of Serbs in the foreign world. Another goal was to give the voice to the Serbs in Canada and a platform to discuss a variety of issues and problems they are experiencing, to represent the Serbian community in the more organized and elevated light to other communities in Canada, to support the Karađorđević royal family and its elected government, to uphold the principles of democracy and fight the communism and its propaganda in the later regime in Yugoslavia, to inform Serbs in Canada on the most current events in Yugoslavia and Serbian diaspora globally. The paper was printed in Cyrillic even though it had an English section since 1946. It was a weekly publication coming out every Thursday from 1945 to 1983, after which it became a monthly publication. The head office was in a modest building on 1297 Drollard Road in Windsor. Most issues had 4 to 6 pages, and the Christmas edition had 8 to 12. There were 48 to 50 issues annually. The content of the Voice of Canadian Serbs dealt largely with the local, social, and religious events in many communities in Ontario, Canada, and the world. It dealt with political commentaries, social and cultural reviews. It dealt with news from Yugoslavia. It advertised local Serbian-owned businesses. It informed of more significant achievements of any Serb in Canada. It reminded Serbs of their cultural and religious traditions. And it provided opportunities for the Serbs in Canada to write and read in their mother tongue. The Voice of Canadian Serbs was indeed the greatest Serbian weekly in the free world. It had a very numerous readership here in Canada, but also in Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and other very populated Serbian colonies in the States. The editorial board did not stop there. They were sending it to every Serbian school, organization, church, and society all over the world. Rumor has it that the Voice of Canadian Serbs was sent to Yugoslavia, whereby a random address would be selected from the phone book and the copy would be sent. The recipients were greatly surprised but would potentially also fall into trouble. The Voice of Canadian Serbs was forbidden in the socialist Yugoslavia for a long time, so if the authorities would take a whiff of anyone receiving it, it would be very suspicious and sometimes even outright intimidating. However, what is not a rumor is that the Voice of Canadian Serbs reached many civilian and military refugees scattered all over Europe, waiting for their uncertain fate in one of the refugee camps. Quite a number of people who came to Canada in Windsor read about the existing colonies and their life here, guided by the hope that somewhere in the unknown Canada there are Serbian colonies which function quite successfully and where they can start building a new life. For the regular subscribers here in Windsor in Canada, the Voice of Canadian Serbs was affordable with a set price of $2.50 for 6 months and $5 for an annual subscription. Pero Bulat, Petar Čuk, and Paja Popov, who were all members of the Serbian National Shield Society, purchased the land on lots 5 and 6 on the west side of Drolord Road, where the small building already existed. The Serbian National Shield Society rented this building between 1945 and 1958, when the building was finally purchased. The Serbian Heritage Museum possesses the deed of land signed before City of Windsor solicitor Audrey Rosenthal, who represented the law firm McTague, DeZiel, Clark, and Holland. Half of the building was converted into offices, and the other half was the print shop. People who worked at the Voice of Canadian Serbs and later at the Avala Printing and Publishing remembered the small space very well. As you enter, they would say you come up to a counter where you made your enquiries, paid your subscription, submitted your articles, etc. Behind this counter, there were 2 writing desks where administrator and the graphic designer worked on a variety of tasks. Behind their space was the actual editor's office, and once passed, one would approach a paper cutter and some shelving where volunteers were organizing papers for mailing and distribution. This small and modest space was actually very busy and active. It was the center of Serbian publishing and journalistic activity in Canada, a very special place where the community and diaspora were able to keep their window to the world open. Here you see a photo from the early 50s when the Voice of Canadian Serbs experienced a tremendous boom. Many newcomers were highly educated with many diplomatic and intellectual accomplishments. Such a group gravitated around the Voice of Canadian Serbs and really tried to raise the newspaper to the new heights. Some of these individuals were Rade Knežević, Dr. Jovan Jovetic, Olga Marković, who was the daughter of Božidar Marković, Pero Bulat, and Fedor Rajić. The comprehensive list of all the Voice of Canadian Serbs editors tells us that in Windsor there were many intellectuals of a strong caliber at the time, and all of them wanted to see the Voice of Canadian Serbs prosper. During the 50s and 60s, the Voice of Canadian Serbs and Avala Printing and Publishing, which were both owned by the Serbian National Shield Society, were functioning with great success. As the body of subscribers grew, so did the interest of the scattered Serbian intellectuals. Many of them were former diplomats, powerful politicians, doctors of law, renowned historians, poets, pretenders to the throne, novelists, etc. All of them were very interested to have their story heard and their opinion listened to. The opportunity opened up for all those who were suddenly marginalized members of the former elite who were scattered all over the world. They could not continue their careers in the socialist Yugoslavia and were looking for a chance to stay active, to keep their credentials, and to contribute to the preservation of Serbian culture that was devastated by the World War II. To hear more about the important figures of Voice of Canadian Serbs in the next few slides, please refer to our second lecture, Serbian Writers in Windsor. The Serbian National Shield Society did not have a large budget to use for equipping the new headquarters for the Voice of Canadian Serbs. Savo Kovac tells us that they found an old linotype machine in Simcoe at the military base. They purchased 3 of them to start and had some difficulty on transporting them to Windsor. Later on, the original Heidelberg machine was shipped from Germany. It was a very versatile machine which could take care of smaller orders for brochures, business cards, posters, pamphlets, as well as the main bulk of the operation that the Voice of Canadian Serbs took up. The print shop was equipped to print in Russian, English, German, Italian, Serbian, and a few other European languages. So, aside from printing the Voice of Canadian Serbs on a weekly basis, the small shop was able to fulfill a good number of small orders that provided good and steady income. King Peter maintained close ties with Serbs in the States and Canada. He visited almost every 2 years. His route was usually starting in Boston, then New York, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and then Toronto and Montreal before returning home. Since the Voice of Canadian Serbs and Avala Publishing House put Windsor more visibly on the map, His Majesty wanted to see how exactly Windsorites are doing it. He visited the Voice of Canadian Serbs headquarters, by that time famed and known all over the Serbian diaspora. Here, Pero Bulat is possibly explaining how the newspaper operation works and what the accomplishments are. It seems that the king is intrigued and is listening carefully. The king's brother Tomislav also visited Windsor and as well wanted to see how Avala and Voice of Canadian Serbs are doing. Luckily, the museum has more images from this trip and their visit to the print shop. Here you see our hosts Fedor Rajic, Pero Bulat, and Milorad Gaciša explaining the printing processes to the curious Princess Marguerite and the polite Prince Tomislav. The other 2 newspapers which ran at the same time as the Voice of Canadian Serbs in Windsor were the Yugoslav Observer in English and the Democratic Thought in Serbian. The editors of both were an experienced writer, Adam Pribicevic, and a young and ambitious Fedor Rajic. Unfortunately, we do not have a copy of the Yugoslav Observer in the museum, but we do have a bound copy of Democratic Thought. This newspaper was a monthly publication and was specifically focused on the democratic processes, or lack thereof, in the transition of Yugoslavia from kingdom into a socialist federative republic. It was mostly a platform for Mr. Adam Pribicevic to continue his political work in finding processes to better represent Serbs all over the world. Unfortunately, both newspapers did not run longer than 2 years. Partially it was due to the lack of funds. Mr. Pribicevic was getting older and Mr. Rajic needed to find an additional source of income. The Voice of Canadian Serbs moved back to Toronto after the death of its long-term publisher, Pero Bulat, in 1983. At the time, Avala and the Voice of Canadian Serbs did not have any money left after all the creditors were paid off. Also, the initial group which brought it to Windsor either died out or was not willing to continue running it any longer. A new group of people was ready to transfer the paper back to its birthplace, Toronto. Bora Dragašević, Draga Dragašević, Olga Marković, Dusan Bilić, and a few others devoted all their energy to revive it and increase the subscriptions. The paper became a monthly publication, and a few years later it was coming out every 2 months due to the lack of manpower. However, the content is still very interesting and focused more on the local communities than on the political discourses. Perhaps it is better this way. The Voice of Canadian Serbs is the 3rd oldest newspaper that has run in continuation in Serbian language after Politika from Belgrade and American Serbian from Pittsburgh.